So welcome everybody to I think this is lecture 38, I think. We're about to study chapter 53 in part 1 of Mor Nevuchim. And Rambam is in the chapters that we studied the last couple of weeks and the chapters we will be studying tonight and the next couple of weeks. He is going to be discussing how we understand the idea of God's, in English, we're calling his attributes, which basically means the one is often finds God described as having a certain attribute, like being merciful, being kind, being all-knowing, being powerful, all kinds of things. And Rambam, after having spent a while convincing us that we can't attribute corporeality to God, now he's spending a lot of time explaining to us why we can't give God attributes. We can't describe him in any way. And at the end of the last chapter, he said the only thing we can do, and this is going to be the overriding principle for the next few chapters and tonight as well, is we can look at God's actions, the things that exist in this world. We can see what happens and what we experience and what we see, and we can describe God as the one being responsible for those things. So when we experience kindness, when we experience salvation, when we experience freedom, when we experience anything good or unfortunately, or if we experience anything bad, we can describe God as the one who made that happen. But we can't attribute it to God by saying that God is kind. We can just say there is kindness and God is the one. So that was the end of the last chapter. So now he's going to, and we may get to this tonight, but I want to give you a little hint that in chapter 54, the next one, Rambam is going to directly take this because it came up many times in the last 3 weeks. People asking me, what about the Yud Gimel Midos? What about the attributes of God as they are described in the Torah? So specifically, Rambam is going to, after tonight's chapter, he's laying down the foundations to understand chapter 54, in which he directly reads through that parsha of the Torah and shows how, rather than what we always thought, that it's describing God's attributes, it's actually saying, at least according to Maimonides' reading, exactly what Maimonides has been trying to tell us. So I told you, I promised you we're going to get there, and I told everyone to wait. We may or may not get there tonight, but we're getting really close to looking at that parsha and then seeing, we're going to see it in Rambam's eyes. It's going to mean something completely different than we always thought. And so we're leading there. We're getting there. He's putting down the building blocks. So now we have to go through chapter 53. So first he says the reasons that led those who believe in the existence of attributes, right? And the Hebrew translation of kapach uses the word toarim, meaning rather than attributes, he uses the term toarim, which is like descriptions of God, right? So belonging to the Creator are to this belief are akin to those that led those who believe in the doctrine of his corporeality to that belief. The same way that people made a mistake and thought that God is powerful because he has big muscles or he looks like an old man or whatever, right? It's the reason people made that mistake. They also make this mistake and give God attributes. For he believes in this doctrine was not led to it by intellectual speculation. They didn't sit down and think God must have attributes and philosophically prove it and therefore argue that, but rather he merely followed the external sense of the text of the scriptures. The external sense of the psukim, of the verses, are that God is described as having certain attributes. So this is also the case with regard to the attributes. For inasmuch as the books of the prophets and the revealed books existed, which predicated attributive qualifications of him may be exalted, these were taken in their literal sense, and he was believed to possess attributes. Okay, that makes sense, right? The psukim led us to believe that the psukim that describe God as being merciful, or whichever verse you're looking at, makes one think that God, we can describe God in those ways. The people in question have, as it were, divested God of corporeality. So I've gotten you past the idea. The people that are now giving God attributes have gotten past the idea that God is corporeal, has a body, but they have not of the modes of corporeality, but they haven't gotten yet out of the point where the things that corporeality does, right? you can describe a human being, or you can describe a being by saying it is a merciful being, it is a kind being, it is a powerful being, it is a smart being, it is a wise being. But you can go on and on with attributes, but they didn't get the fact that once it's not enough to take away the corporeality of God. You have to take away any descriptors that indicate some kind of description of God's essence, right? So with regard to every attribute that the believer in attributes considers to be essential in respect to God may be exalted, you will find that the notion of it is that of a quality, even if these people do not state it clearly. What they're basically saying is that God has a certain quality, which is a problem, right? And we should know by now why Rambam doesn't like that. So even if they don't tell you that they think that God's essence changed because I'm calling him kind, well, when they say that God is kind, they're actually saying, they're describing something about his essence. There's something in God's essence that is kind, right? For they in fact liken the attribute in question to what they meet with in the various states of all bodies endowed with an animal soul. When I say God is kind, what do I immediately think? I think of a person that I know, and if I see an animal do something kind, or a person do something kind, so I think God does something kind, right? So the only way we can imagine kindness is by using corporeal things that we're used to, that we see, that are tangible. So of all this, it is said the Torah speaketh in the language of the sons of man. The Torah describes it that way, but you should know that that's not what's actually going on. The purpose for which all these attributes are used is to predicate perfection of him, but not the particular notion that is a perfection with respect to creatures possessing a soul, right? The reason why we use these attributes and describe God that way is to impress upon human beings how perfect and how great God is, but not the same kind of perfection when I describe a human being as being perfect. When I say a person is perfect, that means he's kind, he's honest, but most of these attributes are attributes pertaining to his diverse actions. However, when you look through the Torah, you'll see that when God is described with attributes, it really isn't talking about descriptors of God himself. It's actually discussing the things that we see, the actions that God is responsible for, that we are able to see, that are tangible, that are in this world. Now, there need not be a diversity in the notion subsisting in an agent because of the diversity of its various actions. If you might automatically think, and Rambam brought up this question earlier and said he was going to address it, but now he's addressing it, and that is the following: if God is a singular essence, but you and I, when we look out at this world and we see all the actions that he's responsible for, we see lots of different things. We see kindness, and we see darkness and suffering. We see light and dark. We see hot and cold. We see earthquakes and volcanoes. We see seas and deserts. We see all kinds of things that are very different from each other. So if God is a singular essence, how could it be that his actions are so different, are so varied? But Rambam says that's not a problem, right? Why? Because I'm going to give you an example of this. I shall give you an instance taken from things that ought to be found with us. I can give you an example from this world, and then you can try to extrapolate and understand how it could be from God. I mean, an example of the fact that though an agent is one, diverse actions may proceed from him, even if he does not possess will, and all the more if he acts through will. So, because an instance of this is fire. What's the example of fire? Because what does fire do? Some things it melts, some things it hardens, some things it cooks and burns, some things it bleaches and blackens. Depending on what you do with the fire and what substance you put in the fire and how hot you make the fire, etc., or how long it's in the fire, different things happen. So thus, if some man would predicate a fire that it is that which bleaches and blackens, which burns and cooks, which makes hard and which melts, he would say the truth. If you describe fire and says the fire does all of these things, that's true. The fire is responsible for all of those actions, right? But he hasn't described the essence of the fire, but he's described all the actions that the fire accomplishes. Accordingly, he who does not know the nature of fire, if you find somebody who's never seen a fire before, right, he thinks that there's subsist in it 6 diverse notions. There must be 6 different things inside the fire. The fire has some quality that makes it be able to do this, and some quality that makes it able to do that. by means of which it blackens, whereas it bleaches by means of another, it cooks by means of a third, and burns by means of a fourth, melts fifth, makes hard by means of a sixth. All these actions being opposed to one another. For the meaning of any one of them is different from that of any other. So that's what someone would think if he never saw a fire. However, you and I know fire, we see fire, right? He who knows the nature of fire knows that it performs all these actions by virtue of one active quality, which is heat. Fire is just an extremely large amount of heat. In the Rambam's description, we might describe it as energy, but whatever it is, it's one essence, right? Therefore, we know that fire has one essence, but it accomplishes many actions. All right. So if I say the fire can do lots of things, or that lots of things are done by the fire, I'm not claiming that the fire has 6 different notions within it. The fire is the same thing, right? So so that's talking about fire that has no will. There is no brain in the fire that wants to. The fire doesn't say, okay, now I'm going to melt, and now I'm going to cook some macaroni, and now I'm going to warm up someone's house, right? The fire doesn't do that. The fire just burns. Right. But if, let's say, such a state of affairs with the thing acting by virtue of its nature, right, it exists all the more, which is fire, it exists all the more with respect to one who acts through will. For a person who decides to do something, a human being can punch someone in the face when he's mad, or he can shake someone's hand nicely, or give someone a hug, right? So a person can do all kinds of actions with the same body and the same body parts, right? Because we have a will to decide. But does the essence of the hand that punched, shook, or hugged change? No, right? So all the more, so that's true if you go from fire to a human being that has will, that has a desire, a will to do something. However, all the more with respect to him may be exalted, who is above every attribute of qualification. Here we can't even. So God, for sure, we don't understand his essence, but just because his essence is one doesn't mean that he should be incapable of doing lots and lots of different things. The one essence can accomplish infinite amount of different actions and an infinite amount of different things. This is true, by the way, when we wonder, like, if God is good, why is there evil in the world? Part of Rambam's answer, and he's putting this building block here to tell us, it's not just with regard to melting and burning and cooking or God's creations being different, but it's the way he manifests. Sometimes it's very harsh and evil and difficult, and sometimes it's very good and wonderful and sweet. So all of those things, the essence of God is capable of all of those manifestations, because everything that we experience can still come out of the same essence, this is just a little bit, a building block of Rambam's answer to that famous difficult question, which, as we go through the book, we're going to get more and more building blocks so that we'll understand how he would answer all of these questions. We have grasped with regard to him relations having corresponding diverse notions. You understand why I said that? Because some religions have a difficult problem. If God is good, then why is there bad? Well, Rambam would say you can't describe God as good, right? You can say that I experience things that are good in this world and God made them happen. But you can say that God is good, because that's an attribute. Okay, so that the question doesn't even start. For the notion of knowledge is in us other than the notion of, okay, so we have grasped with regard to him relations having corresponding diverse notions, right? So we now know that when we're referring to God, right, there can be relations, things that happen in this world that relate to God, in other words, that God created, that can correspond to different notions. Different things that happen in the world correspond to different notions, even though they come from the same essence. For the notion of knowledge is in us other than the notion of power, and the latter other than the notion of will, right? The fact that we have knowledge is, for us as human beings, different than the fact that we have power or ability or strength to do something, which is also different from the notion of will, which is the desire to do something, the will to do something. Yet how can we regard as a necessary consequence of this the subsistence in him of diverse notions that are essential to him, so that there would subsist in him something by virtue of which he knows, as well as something by virtue of which he wills, and something by virtue of which he has power? So for this is the meaning of the attributes whose existence is asserted by the people. I'm sorry, I think I So the Rambam is going to mention in a minute. I have to go ahead a little to understand what he's saying here. There's four basic notions, right, that the Islamic philosophers attribute to God, right? And Rambam is not implicitly, he's explicitly attacking them, right? Those four notions, and he introduces them here as if we knew what they were talking about, is the idea of living. God is living, whatever alive means. Alive means something that exists, something that's real, something that's alive. God has knowledge, God has will, and God has power. Those are the four notions. And in the Islamic philosophies, those four notions are accepted as basic to God. So if you had to boil down the attributes given to God, which Rambam is arguing with, he's saying now that we can't give those attributes to him. So when he makes this notion here, he's saying, for you and I, right, the notion of knowledge is different than power, which is different than will. So then how could we then say, this is what the Rambam is saying here, I'm at the bottom of page 120. How can we regard as a necessary consequence of this, right? How could we say that God has diverse notions that are essential to him, so that he would have something that he knows and something that he wills and something that has power, right? If those are different in a human being, those reflect different things. And if we say those things about God, then we'd be reflecting different things about God. For this is the meaning of the attributes whose existence is asserted by the people in question. The people that I'm talking about, the philosophers that state this about God, right, would assert this is true about God, but if you said it about a person, you'd be talking about four different notions. So if you say it about God, that means it's four different notions, and that's impossible. There can't be four different anythings in God. So some of them state this clearly, enumerating the notions that are superadded to the essence, which according to Rambam would be heresy, right? Others belonging to them, and I remember he's referring here to Islamic philosophers. I only know this not because I'm an expert in Islamic philosophy, but because Rabbi Kapach in the Hebrew translation brings down the Islamic philosophers that he's referring to and exactly these ideas to explain what he's talking about. So this is the others belonging to them do not state this clearly. However, it is quite clear in their belief, even if it is not expressed in comprehensible language. They kind of jumble around it because they want to stick with monotheism and God being one, but they still keep saying things that have God having these attributes. So this is the case when some of them assert that he possesses power because of his essence, possesses knowledge because of his essence, is living because of his essence, has will because of his essence. It's similar to when Rambam attacked the Christian theology of the Trinity before, where he said he's three, but he's one, but he's three, but he's one. It doesn't work, right? If he doesn't have, you can't start saying that he has this attribute, because once you give him an attribute, you're changing the essence and he's not one anymore. So you can't say that. So then he says, I shall illustrate this by the example. I'm sorry, I want to stop here if anyone wants to, this is to ask anything, or because this is kind of getting pretty deep into the philosophy here. So does anybody want to bring anything up before I read the rest of this? Is everybody kind of hanging in there? I'm trying to make it as simple as possible, and it's rough.
All right. I'm all right.
Okay, we're good. Okay, so now he's going to give an example. So, because he realizes that what he's talking about before is that all this is kind of difficult conceptually. So I shall illustrate this by the example of the rational faculty subsisting in man. We all have a rational faculty. You know, there's a process. Nowadays, we know in our brain thinks, right? The idea that our brain thinks and thinks thoughts and comes to conclusions and decides things, etc. It is one faculty with regard to which no multiplicity. Nobody says that there's 10 different thinkings going on. The brain thinks right now. Nowadays, we might say it's a little different. We have pathways in our brain that do different types of thinking and stuff. But the general idea is still true. I think that there's a thought process. Our brain has a process. The neurons fire. The neurotransmitters transmit messages from one neuron to the other, and it creates this big process of thought. Out of that process of thought, lots of things come, right? Through it, he acquires the sciences and the arts, right? You can do all this philosophical speculation, and you can also conjure up a beautiful song, or a beautiful poem, or a beautiful painting or sculpture, right? Through the same faculty, he sews, carpenters, weaves, builds, and has a knowledge of geometry, and governs us, and can be a politician and govern a city. Those are very different actions. However, they proceed from one simple faculty in which no multiplicity is posited. No, they're all coming from the same brain, right? It's all a thought process, but they result in many different actions that are very different from each other. Now, these actions are very different. Their number is almost infinite. I mean, the number of the arts brought forth by the rational faculty, if you think about how many different types of songs and types of music and genres of music can come out, right? It's infinite. It doesn't end. There's so much creativity that this one brain, and what's the brain doing? Thinking. It's the same thing, right? It accordingly should not be regarded as inadmissible in reference to God, may he be magnified and honored, that the diverse actions proceed from one simple essence in which no multiplicity is posited, and which no notion is superadded. So Rambam is emphasizing, therefore, when I'm describing God and I say that there's myriads of things, countless, infinitely, it's impossible to count the amount of things that are happening in the world and the things that we see around us. And we still don't have to say that there's anything added to the singular essence of God himself. Every attribute that is found in the books of the deity, may he be exalted, is therefore an attribute of his action. So every single time we see something described in the Torah, right, or Chazal, or anywhere else, or any book describing something great about God, what it's really doing is telling you that thing in the world is great. That thing that we see is great. And God was the one that made that happen, right? It is therefore an attribute of his action and not an attribute of his essence. So it doesn't describe the essence of God at all, but it does describe what he did, right? Or it is indicative of absolute perfection. Or it is an attribute which is basically just describing God's perfection, which Rambam is going to come back to later, a couple chapters from now, that idea that you can give God certain attributes as long as what the attribute is describing is God's lack of attributes, is God's oneness, his perfection, etc. Those things are ways that you can describe God, but he kind of throws that off on the side here. There, accordingly, is not, as these people believe, an essence composed of diverse notions. So don't make the mistake that they're making. For the fact that they do not use the term composition, even though they don't say, I'm describing what God is made out of, right? It doesn't abolish the notion of composition with regard to the essence possessing attributes. The bottom line is if you're describing God with attributes and saying that he has them, you've already gone the wrong direction. However, there exists a point of doubt that led them to this doctrine. There is something that led them to think this is true. This is the one I'm going to explain to you. What led them to think this is true? For those who believe in attributes do not do so because of the multiplicity of his actions. They don't say that God has these 4 attributes because they looked around the world and saw so many different actions, and therefore they said God must have different aspects to him, right? Rather, do they say, yes, the one essence performs diverse actions, but the attributes that are essential to him may be exalted do not belong to his action. These attributes are somehow separate, which is Rambam would say, no, the attributes are not separate. The actions of God, that's the only place we see attributes, right? According to Rambam. But these people are saying, no, there's God, there's the basic attributes, and then there's his actions that he does. For it is not permissible to imagine that God has created in his own essence, right? One cannot think that God created himself, right? So therefore, they say they differ with respect to those attributes that they call essential. They have to say there have to be certain essential things within God. And what those things are, I mean, with regard to their number, right? They debate whether there's 4 attributes or 7 attributes, which I listed to you the 4. Kapach mentions other Islamic groups that boil it down to 5. I'm 7, I'm sorry. I'm on the wrong page here. Which it doesn't matter what they are, but the point is that in as much, and this is where the English text loses something, it says in as much as all of them follow the text of some book. Well, the Hebrew translation, they're following the Quran. And he quotes that out of from the Quran, they got this idea that God actually has attributes, and Rambam is here arguing with that idea. So it's important because we do pick up throughout the book Rambam's differentiating between what he believes is Judaism versus the two major other religions of the time that Rambam dealt with, which were Christianity and Islam. And this is one place where he does that. So this text of some book of Kapach explains is the Quran. We shall mention that as to which all of them agree and consider to be cognized by the intellect, and in which case there is no need to follow the text of the word of the prophet. And now he says there are 4 such attributes, and which he already referred to, I already pointed them out to. They all, in other words, all those Islamic scholars agree to these 4. Living, that he's chai, he has power, knowledge, and will. They say that these are distinct notions and such perfections that it would be impossible for the deity to be deprived of any of them. These are so perfect, it can't be that God doesn't have these 4 things, so he has them. And the Rambam says, God does not have these 4 things because we cannot describe God as having anything, right? He can't have an attribute. It is not permissible to suppose that they belong to his actions. This is a summary of their opinion. Now you know that the notion of knowledge in reference to him may be exalted. Now I'm going to tell you why this doesn't work, right? He already did, but he's going to say it again and add some more points. And that is that the notion of knowledge is identical with the notion of life. They separated those into 2 things. But something that's alive and something that knows something is the same thing, right? For everyone who apprehends his own essence, what does it mean? If I think I exist, right? You know, the famous Descartes, I think, therefore I am. It's the same idea. I think. So I know that there is some entity. Everything else may not be true, but there's some entity that is doing the thinking, saying that I'm thinking, and that thing is alive, because otherwise it would be dead and it wouldn't be thinking. So when I say that there's knowledge and I say that there's thinking, I'm saying the same thing, right? I say that there's knowledge and I say there's life, I'm saying the same thing, right? So the apprehension of one's own essence, right? Now the essence that apprehends is undoubtedly the same as the essence that is apprehended. This is really crucial point, and that is that if there's something that's saying I, there's something inside of our soul that says I, that's the identity, that's me, whoever that is, it's me. That thing is apprehending itself. I know that I am because I know that there's such a thing as an I. Otherwise, I wouldn't be having this conversation. That's the only thing that it really knows. Everything else around it is something else. But what the most important thing and the only thing that it really truly apprehends is the I. Everything else we can sit and debate, but that there is an I, that I knows about I. So it's both the apprehended and the thing that's doing the apprehending. As a man is composed of a soul that apprehends and a body that does not apprehend. The body, on the other hand, the soul inside could say, I know something, and I apprehend that there's a body walking around, and there's a body doing this, a body doing that. There's a world that does this, the wind blows, the sun shines, all those things that you apprehend, but those things don't apprehend anything, right? Accordingly, and as much as our saying possessing knowledge is intended to signify he who apprehends his own essence, life and knowledge form in this case one notion. It's really the same thing. So far we started with 4. He says, well, 2 of the 4 are really the same idea. However, the people in question do not consider this notion, but consider rather his apprehension of his creatures. When you talk to these people, when they say that God apprehends, God has knowledge, they're talking about God's knowledge of everything going on around, of the world, of his creatures, his creations. Similar, without any doubt, neither power nor will exists in and belongs to the creator in respect to his own essence. You certainly can't say, when you talk about power and you talk about a will, you can't be talking about God's power for himself, because what's that relevant? God has the power to do what to himself? It makes no sense. He has the will to do what about himself? It also makes no sense, right? What you're talking about is his power to do mighty things in the world with his creations, his will to affect certain things in this world. So, for he does not exercise his power on his own essence, nor can it be predicated of him that he wills his own essence. And nobody represents this to himself, right? Nobody, when they talk about power, refers to themselves, right? Rather, they talk about in reference to something else. Rather, have these attributes been thought of in reference to the diverse relations that maintained between God may be exalted and the things created by him. For he possesses the power to create what he created. He possesses the power to bring into being that which exists in the manner in which he has brought it into being, and also possesses the knowledge of what he has brought into being. Thus it has become clear to you, now that I made all these points, that these attributes too are not to be considered in reference to his essence. So in the end of the story, once you'd say that it's talking about in reference to all of those other things, right? So basically what you just said is that when I say that God has power, all I mean is that these actions on the world that are very powerful can be done by God. Okay. But I didn't describe God's essence at all. So Rambam is removing these attributes, even these basic 4 attributes. He's saying they're not descriptions of God's essence at all. They're just descriptions of his actions in this world. And so for this reason, we, the community of those who profess the unity by virtue of a knowledge of the truth, in other words, this is super powerful because the Rambam is saying we, meaning Jews, right? Who, think about this, absorb this sentence for a second, that profess the unity, right? Because of our knowledge. So Rambam is saying the reason why we have a handle on this unity is because we're not relying on, quote, some book, end quote, right? But because we are relying on a knowledge of the truth, because we figured this out. Okay, this is so powerful. It's not because our Torah is better than their Quran or better than the New Testament Christians, right? It's not because we have, but because we came to this through philosophical and scientific speculation and came to the truth. That's what makes us better than them. So let that sink in, because this is like an incredibly strong statement for what Rambam believes is the nature of truth and how we obtain truth, right? Just as we do not say that there is in his essence a superadded notion by virtue of which he has created the heavens, and another by virtue of which he created the elements, and the third one by virtue of which he has created the intellects. So we do not say that there is in him a superadded notion by virtue of which he possesses power, another possesses will, another possesses the knowledge. His essence, on the contrary, one and simple, having no notion that is superadded to it in any respect. This essence has created everything that it has created and knows it, right? But absolutely not by a virtue of a superadded notion. It makes no difference whether these diverse attributes correspond to his actions or to diverse relations between him and the things produced by the actions. So in other words, you can talk about all these attributes how they correspond to his actions, how they correspond to how he relates to those actions, how those actions, those things in this world, actions meaning everything that exists in the universe, right? In conformity with what we have likewise explained regarding the truth of relation, like we just explained last week when we explained the 5th type of attribute, which it is okay to talk about God. When we talk about how its relation, how God relates to the world, that's the only kind of attribute that it's okay. When we look in this world and we see that we experience something, or we see something being experienced, or perceive something happening in this world, we can say that God is the one that made that happen. God is the one that has the power to make that happen. God is the one that has knowledge of this thing that happened. As long as we don't say that God knows or God does or has certain attributes that describe him, and it's merely something that is in thought. This is what ought to be believed with regard to the attributes mentioned in the books of the prophets. Whenever there are attributes, this is what you need to think. Or, as we shall make clear, it may be believed with regard to some of them that they are attributes indicative of a perfection likened to our perfections, which are understood by us. That last sentence is Rambam saying, and the other times when you can describe God, as long as those descriptions are descriptions of his perfection, of his singularity, of his and the Rambam is gonna, like I said, go into that in more depth. I think it's in chapter 59, but that in some places we can give attributes as long as what they're describing is his indescribability, if that makes any sense. So this concludes this chapter. This is a lot to absorb here. I want to stop. I think this is a good place to stop. And take questions or comments, but go ahead if anyone has anything to contribute.
Yeah, I raised my hand. When we went to the key sentence, or a key sentence, for this reason, you read it earlier, we, the Jews,
Right.
The community of those who profess the unity by virtue of a knowledge of the truth.
Right.
Is he going to later on, or can we infer from this? Does he take it? I won't say the easy way out, but there is the revelation, right? Is the truth somehow tied to that we? It's not that we philosophically are superior and came to this result, but can't you attribute this to this divine revelation, Sinai?
Yeah. Yes. You can. So, in Rambam's thought, there's two ways to reach this truth, right? One is through pure speculation, pure thought, right? And non-Jews can reach this by themselves. And in the Rambam's opinion, the first Jew, Avraham Avinu, Abraham, reached it on his own, right? Reached this truth by himself, by analyzing and observing the world around him. And Rambam also described Aristotle that way, and other great non-Jews that reached the truth. The other way is through the Torah, right? And specifically because through the revelation, God gave us the Torah as a tool to study and achieve this truth. So the Torah is a path. But what's important is over here, the Rambam is saying that the Torah is a path to reach the truth. It's not the truth because the Torah said so, though. It's the truth because it's the truth.
Nice.
The Torah is a way for us to get there. And in fact, in the next chapter, when the Rambam is going to analyze that whole parsha, the whole idea where Moshe asked God for a revelation, and Moshe asked God for his attributes, and God gave him attributes, which we initially, and most people initially think, what's the Rambam talking about all these chapters? What do you mean there's no attributes? God has the midos, the Gimel midos that we call, this is the ultimate place in the Torah and Tanakh where God is described with attributes. The Rambam is going to show us how, through the way he studies that chapter, the conclusion that he reaches is exactly the opposite. The conclusion that the Rambam reaches when he studies that chapter, which we're going to do next week, Amir Tashem, is that there cannot be attributes to God. And if you wonder how that's going to happen, then you have to stay tuned till next week. But it's true that according to Rambam, the truth can be reached, but it's much harder. The gift of Torah to the Jewish people is the gift of having an easier path to that truth. Remember, Rambam also believes you have to be a person that's sholem b'midosov. You have to be a perfect person, right? So you have to be kind, you have to be honest, you have to be true, you have to have all the attributes of a good person. You have to shun worldly pleasures in order to attain this great knowledge, and you have to work and obtain it through knowledge. So you can try to do that without the Torah, and there are people that have. And the classic one is Avraham Avinu, according to Rambam, who reached it on his own. However, the gift of Torah in Rambam's philosophy is if we follow the Torah, give us guidelines how to act good, how to be good people, follow these rules. And I made it easy for you, giving tzedakah is a rule. It's written in the Torah, greeting guests and visiting the sick, and all the mitzvot in the Rambam scheme is a preparation for us to take, and we study the ideas given to us in the Torah, and we will eventually reach this truth, which is the truth of the oneness, the unity of God, which is what we're saying. So, and Moshe Rabbeinu was the ultimate one who reached that height, which where he's really going to deal with the next chapter. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions on what we said, or comments, or observations? It's an open floor.
I have a question.
Please.
If you just follow the sentence that was just read, or the start of the sentence that was just read, it concludes just as in chapter 55 with
53, you mean?
53.
53, yeah.
Okay.
It uses the term super added. It says, just as we do not say that there is in his essence a super added notion by virtue of which he has created heavens, and it goes on.
Right. Okay.
That to me is a little dense, and I don't understand what the term super added means, although it's used repeatedly.
Well, so what he's referring to is that if you take an attribute and you claim that it's describing God in any way, right, then you're adding that notion and plunking it on top of God's essence. So you have the essence right here, and I'm saying that God is in the four essences that he brought from the Muslims, right, was knowledge and will and so let's take will, all right. Now let's take power. God has power. So now you have a notion of power, and you're adding that to the essence. You're saying that there's the essence, but I can describe that essence by saying that it has something. It has power, right? So you've just super added something to that original notion, and you've just lost your handle on monotheism, right? Because, you know, if you say that there's Saul Weinreb and Saul Weinreb has a car, right? You just added a notion to me, right? There's me, and then there's me in my car. But you can't do that with God. You can't say that God has power. Anything that you're adding on. Now you can say that the splitting of the sea was a very powerful thing, right? Well, so God did that. And God interacted with his world in an extremely powerful way. As long as you stay on that level, you're fine. But the moment you say God is powerful, then you're saying there's God, and he just described him with a super added notion of power, which can't work.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. But
Okay.
I mean, it seems to me what you're left with is somebody that is, it was something that is completely unknowable by human faculties, I guess.
Right. That's exactly the point. That's exactly the point. That's what exactly the impression that Rambam is trying to give to us. He's completely and utterly unknowable. And as you were going to see in the next chapter, Rambam is going to say that when God said, a human being cannot see me, God is saying, I can show you so much, and I can bring Moshe to the brink of the height of knowledge any human being has ever reached, but you can't know me, period, because it's impossible. A human being can't.
Okay.
And that's exactly what it's doing. God is totally unknowable, and that's very. I'm glad that you brought it up, because that means Rambam's he's working. It's working on it.
Well, I'm still interested. I mean, I know I asked you this earlier, but about we have in our liturgy about the 13 attributes of Hashem.
Right. So I promise next week, I mean, barring my inability to give next week's lecture for some reason, but chapter 54 is directly Rambam describing the Yud Gimel Midos after he laid the foundation to bring us to the point which exactly you just brought us to, that he's totally unknowable, and he's gonna apply it straight to the Yud Gimel Midos. That's chapter 54, and that's what we're gonna do next week. So I promised you that I'm not pushing you off because I'm trying to push you off. I was pushing off that question because he's bringing us to the answer. So let's let him do it. He's going to do it next week. He's going to show us how that's not attributes. It's not at all. It's the opposite. It's exactly, Rambam is going to show us that what he's been teaching us, if you look at the psukim carefully, that's what the Torah is telling us.
Does he address one additional question? How can you believe in something that's unknowable? How can you embrace something that's unknowable? Is that something that he addresses? Because
well, I think the Rambam would probably, I mean, it's always dangerous to say what Rambam would do, but I can imagine him responding, how could you believe in a God that is knowable?
Okay.
You know, a God that is knowable makes no logical sense. It just doesn't work.
I think Steinfeld says if he was knowable, he's not worth knowing.
That's okay. Saul and Seinfeld made a wise statement. It's true. If once you make God knowable, then you've just humanized him, you've minimized him, and you've made him into something that you and I can play around with in a beaker and a petri dish, right? That's not God. That doesn't mean anything. You know, only a God that's unknowable is the kind of God that makes any sense.
Not to prolong this, but I saw one of these crazy science fiction things last night a Wonder Woman. I saw the end of it,
Right.
and it had this evil, giant with infinite power,
Mhm.
and he was the embodiment of evil. I mean, so if you can't know God, and he's not, how do you know that this creature I saw last evening on Wonder Woman is not God?
Well, first of all, Rambam would say right away, and all those notions, right? Those are based on basic paganism, right? Which is attributing to gods. The reason why this is so important is because attributing qualities to gods is the essence of polytheism, right? Because so this is the evil god, this is the god of war, this is the god of water, this is the god of heat, so on and so forth. You're attributing, and that's why it's so important to get to a God that's philosophically sound according to the Rambam and morally sound, right? According to the Torah, it has to be a God that you cannot describe with attributes. That's why, and remember when Rambam made it so careful to say today, what we studied together, that you can't ask me any more questions how it is that God can manifest in so many different ways, right? A polytheist has a different answer to that problem, right? How it is that God can, in one day, I have just, everything is great and I'm doing really well and I'm healthy and I have a beautiful wife and a beautiful house and a beautiful car. And then the next day I get cancer and there's a war and there's a nuclear bomb, right? So how do you explain that? So it can't all be coming from the same source, because you can't take the concept of separating the attributes from the essence they don't have. Every essence has to be described with an attribute. So this one is good, this one is bad. There's a God of war, there's a God of water, there's a God of goodness, there's a God of love, there's a God of fire, so on and so forth.
But it wasn't implicit in the last statement you're telling me, is that God is not that evil creature that I saw on Wonder Woman last night. So he's not that.
You can't describe God as evil. You can't describe God as good. You can't describe God as anything, because you can't describe God. But you want me to believe that the essence. You want me to believe that this evil creature with the horns and the infinite power, right, is not God. Because if I don't not believe that, then I have a whole difficulty with embracing God, because I don't want to include that possibility in my framework.
If you're shalem b'midotav, you wouldn't include that in that possibility. It's just
you wouldn't be watching Wonder Woman.
It's a chisaron in us, not in God. Meaning like we're the ones who are lacking, not.
Yeah, I mean, so like we can describe ourselves with attributes. We can describe anything that we can see in this tangible world with attributes, except for God, because God isn't in this tangible world and he can't be described with attributes. And therefore, that singular essence can produce myriads of actions, each one very different from each other. Some of them are good, some of them we perceive as good, some of them we perceive as bad, But so we no longer need to develop images of gods that are mighty, powerful, strong, mean, nice, whatever, And that's really, that's what makes monotheism such a powerful idea.
I have one question. I'm not sure if this is suitable, but would you say that this notion of God is shared by much of the history by much of the scholars and the rabbis of historical in Judaism, or is it?
I mean, the notion of Rambam's notions of God's oneness and the things that he's describing here are not officially controversial in Judaism. I mean, this has become the accepted notion of God. This is pretty much standard in Judaism today, right? And it's standard. Now, Rambam will tell you, and he did say in this chapter, a lot of people don't truly get it. So they continuously describe God in all kinds of ways. And in a lot of their minds, they get really jumbled. Like if you pin them to the wall and say, what's the real deal? They'll say, oh, no, of course God doesn't have attributes, right? Mm-hmm. But then 5 seconds later, they're talking about his attributes. So a lot of people get this all jumbled, and especially as you go down from the more sophisticated to less sophisticated people get it really jumbled. so that's one thing. But then there are definitely Jewish thinkers that don't read like this at all. But it's a complex question, because like everyone keeps asking, what about what we read in the liturgy? How does this mean? Some of it is very hard to try to explain away with Maimonidean thought. The example last week came up of Anim's Mirod. It's extremely difficult to read something like that and imagine how the Rambam would go for something like that.
Mhm.
Right? It's just hard. It's just impossible. After read just today's chapter, it's so what were the people that wrote those things thinking when they wrote it? It's a deep and important question, and I don't have the answer to that. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, almost every Jewish thinker, certainly today, if you go over to him or her and ask, is God one? Does God have attributes that? No. And they may even be able to quote monotheism and say, no, absolutely not. But then the language that they use then is sometimes very hard to, especially once you get into the Kabbalistic descriptions. That's where it starts to get extremely difficult to I don't know what the right word is.
Extricate.
To make it work with the Rambam. That's why the people that claim that the Rambam knew or understood Kabbalah, I think it's just, I don't think this is my humble opinion. To say that is to just not understand the Rambam, I think. And also not to understand Kabbalah. I mean, I just don't get it. But it's okay. It's all good. Everyone has their opinions. But we're going to keep working through this, and you'll see we're going to keep developing. Every single week you get another building block. And then every single week you can be able to look at the prayers in a different way. You look at the Torah in a different way. And it's beautiful. It builds a beautiful building. Anything else before I close up for the day?
No, that's plenty.
All right. Well, thank you guys for joining me. Have a wonderful evening, and looking forward to next week.
Absolutely.
All right. Be well.
Thank you.